The structural stability of the Jewish presence in Vienna during the mid-17th century was fundamentally defined by the aftermath of the Peace of Westphalia. Following the conclusion of the 30 Years' War in 1648, the Habsburg monarchy faced a depleted treasury and a fractured domestic economy. The ruling administration recognized that the restoration of imperial authority required immediate access to liquid capital and established credit networks. Consequently, the state permitted a controlled resettlement of Jewish families within the capital to serve as indispensable fiscal intermediaries. This arrangement was not based on civil equality, but on a transactional legal framework where residency was contingent upon direct service to the crown. The community operated under a specific set of imperial privileges that bypassed local municipal laws and guild restrictions. These charters granted the right to engage in large-scale wholesale trade and the provision of military supplies, activities often restricted for the Christian urban population. By 1650, the population had grown to approximately 500 families, each paying significant annual taxes directly to the royal chamber. This financial contribution provided the monarchy with a degree of fiscal autonomy from the provincial estates. However, this legal standing was inherently fragile, as it depended entirely on the personal will of the reigning sovereign and the perceived economic utility of the subjects. The community was managed through a centralized board of elders responsible for the collection and delivery of imperial levies. While they were granted internal religious autonomy, their physical presence remained a subject of constant negotiation with the city authorities. The legal designation of the community placed them outside the standard feudal hierarchy, making them a unique and vulnerable class of royal dependents. This era of limited protection established the demographic foundation that would eventually be dismantled by the radical shift in state policy at the end of the century. The demographic concentration of the Jewish population in 17th century Vienna was defined by the compulsory resettlement to the Lower Word district. Situated on a secondary island formed by the Danube branches, this marshy terrain became the primary site for communal development following the official allocation of land by the imperial court. By 1625, the area transitioned from a peripheral grazing ground into a densely populated urban quarter. The spatial organization of the district was dictated by security requirements and royal oversight, resulting in a network of narrow streets and timber-framed structures. Unlike the stone-built residences of the inner-city nobility, the buildings here were constructed with the expectation of temporary tenure, reflecting the legal instability of the inhabitants. At the center of the district stood the Great Synagogue, which functioned as the administrative and judicial hub for the autonomous Jewish leadership. This institution managed the internal distribution of communal taxes and ensured compliance with imperial mandates. Surrounding the synagogue were specialized facilities essential for the maintenance of religious law, including ritual baths and separate processing centers for meat. Educational infrastructure was equally robust, with schools established for the training of the male youth in the local dialect and sacred texts. By the middle of the century, the district housed nearly 3,000 individuals, making it one of the largest concentrations of urban Jewish life in Central Europe. The topography of the island provided a natural boundary that facilitated both internal cohesion and external containment. Royal guards were stationed at the bridge connecting the enclave to the city proper to monitor the movement of goods and people. This physical isolation allowed the community to preserve distinct social customs and linguistic patterns while remaining under the constant surveillance of the Habsburg administration. The district's growth was characterized by vertical expansion and the conversion of storage spaces into living quarters to accommodate the steady influx of refugees from the northern territories. This concentrated urban environment represented the physical manifestation of the precarious balance between state-sanctioned utility and systemic social exclusion. The fiscal integration of the Jewish community into the Austrian state apparatus was centered on the provision of large-scale credit and logistical support for the standing army. As the Habsburg monarchy engaged in protracted conflicts with the Ottoman Empire and internal European rivals, The demand for immediate liquidity exceeded the capacity of traditional provincial taxation. Jewish court agents, operating as high-level financial intermediaries, bridged this deficit by advancing substantial sums to the imperial treasury. These loans were often secured against future customs revenues or salt monopolies, effectively turning the community into a primary creditor of the central government. This systemic reliance allowed the crown to bypass the slow bureaucratic processes of the regional estates. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews, and did they actually deserve it? Beyond direct lending, the community managed the complex logistics of military procurement. They were responsible for the acquisition and transport of essential commodities, including grain, horses, and textiles for uniforms. Their extensive networks of correspondence across Central and Eastern Europe facilitated the movement of goods through territories where standard commercial channels were often disrupted by warfare. In exchange for these services, the most prominent financiers were granted the title of court factor, a designation that provided them with personal immunity from local tolls and the right to reside in the inner city. These individuals functioned as unofficial members of the imperial administration, advising the treasury on currency stabilization and the management of public debt. The economic activities of the community also stimulated the broader urban economy through the management of luxury trade and the import of precious metals. They controlled the flow of bullion into the imperial mint, ensuring a steady supply of silver for the production of coinage. While the Christian guilds were restricted by rigid local regulations, Jewish entrepreneurs utilized more flexible credit instruments, such as bills of exchange, to facilitate international transactions. This specialized proficiency in high finance rendered them indispensable to the survival of the imperial regime during periods of acute fiscal crisis. The relationship was strictly professional, driven by the immediate requirements of a permanently mobilized military state. The accession of Emperor Leopold I in 1658 signaled a fundamental reorientation of the Habsburg state toward the principles of the Counter-Reformation. Educated originally for the clergy, Leopold possessed a worldview dominated by a rigorous commitment to Roman Catholic orthodoxy and the elimination of religious dissent within the hereditary lands. His governance was characterized by the elevation of spiritual advisors to the highest circles of political decision-making, a shift that marginalized the pragmatic economic considerations of his predecessors. This new administration viewed the presence of a non-Christian minority not as a fiscal asset, but as a theological anomaly that threatened the divine favor of the monarchy. The emperor's personal piety translated into a systematic effort to align the laws of the realm with ecclesiastical doctrine. Under this more rigid framework, the legal status of the Jewish community was subjected to intensive re-examination by the imperial chancellery. The state began to prioritize religious homogeneity over the immediate benefits of flexible credit and military supply lines. Leopold instituted a policy of increasing legislative scrutiny, frequently reviewing ancient charters to identify legal grounds for limiting communal autonomy. The central government also facilitated the establishment of Jesuit-led missions aimed at the conversion of the minority population, often using economic pressure as a primary incentive. This period witnessed a significant cooling in the relationship between the crown and its financial agents, as the emperor sought to distance the court from its reliance on non-Christian capital. The political climate was further destabilized by the increasing influence of the Privy Council, which advocated for the strengthening of the monarchy through absolute cultural uniformity. Legislative acts were passed that prohibited the construction of new religious facilities and imposed stricter dress codes to enforce social separation. The state also began to monitor communal correspondence and scholarly output, seeking to prevent the dissemination of any material deemed contrary to the established faith. This era of heightened surveillance and doctrinal rigidity established the necessary administrative preconditions for a totalizing policy of exclusion. The emperor's conviction that religious purity was a prerequisite for imperial stability rendered the long-standing transactional protection increasingly obsolete in the eyes of the Habsburg court. The arrival of Margarita Teresa of Spain in 1666 as the consort of Leopold I significantly accelerated the shift toward a policy of total religious exclusion. As the daughter of King Philip IV, she brought with her the uncompromising spiritual rigor of the Spanish Habsburgs, an environment where the Inquisition had long established a precedent for the complete removal of non-Catholics. Her presence at the Viennese court transformed the personal piety of the emperor into a coordinated political agenda focused on the purification of the imperial household and its capital. The empress viewed the legal toleration of a Jewish minority as a spiritual stain that invited divine disfavor upon the dynasty. Her influence was exercised through her personal staff and spiritual advisors, many of whom occupied key positions within the royal apartments. Diplomatic correspondence from the Spanish embassy indicates that the empress made the removal of the Jewish population a central condition of her domestic contentment. She frequently associated the recurring health problems of the royal family and the deaths of imperial infants with a continued presence of unbelievers in the proximity of the palace. This narrative provided a visceral, emotional justification for the administrative measures already being considered by the Privy Council. The empress's patronage of the mendicant orders further disseminated these views among the urban populace, bridging the gap between elite court opinion and popular religious sentiment. Her influence ensured that the question of expulsion remained a primary topic of discussion during private audiences with the emperor. Furthermore, the empress's insistence on a strictly Catholic environment led to the dismissal of Jewish merchants from providing services to the inner court. This policy of social and economic detachment was intended to demonstrate that the state could function entirely without the involvement of non-baptized agents. The systematic pressure exerted by the empress functioned as a powerful catalyst, overriding the remaining pockets of pragmatic opposition within the imperial bureaucracy. By framing the expulsion as a necessary act of dynastic and religious devotion, she provided the moral weight required for the emperor to finalize the transition from discriminatory legislation to physical banishment. The religious climate of the court was thus perfected into an instrument of absolute intolerance, marking the end of the transactional coexistence that had defined the previous generation. The operational planning for the 1670 expulsion was primarily directed by Bishop Leopold Karl von Kolonich, a senior ecclesiastical official who leveraged his position within the imperial court to engineer the removal of the Jewish population. As a former member of the Order of Malta and a high-ranking cleric, he combined military administrative experience with a radical theological agenda. His influence over the emperor was based on the premise that a sovereign's primary duty was the defense of a monolithic Catholic state. Unlike other advisors who viewed the Jewish community through a purely fiscal lens, the bishop categorized their presence as an inherent threat to social stability and religious order. He utilized his seat on the Commission for Religious Affairs to systematically advocate for the termination of all existing residency permits. The bishop's strategy involved the compilation of extensive dossiers that cataloged alleged legal infractions and social grievances against the minority. He argued that the economic utility of Jewish financiers was a deceptive advantage that masked a deeper long-term damage to the Christian artisan classes. By presenting selective data to the imperial treasury, he contended that the state could replace Jewish credit with domestic Catholic banking initiatives, thereby eliminating the need for non-baptized intermediaries. This administrative maneuver was crucial in neutralizing the pragmatic objections of court officials who feared a sudden loss of liquid capital. The bishop also played a key role in coordinating the legal arguments used to justify the unilateral cancellation of centuries-old imperial charters. Furthermore, he initiated a campaign of sermonizing and public declarations intended to prepare the urban populace for the coming administrative shift. This coordinated effort ensured that the eventual decree would be perceived not as a radical departure from tradition, but as a long-awaited restoration of justice. His influence was so pervasive that he became the primary contact for municipal leaders seeking royal intervention against Jewish commercial interests. By transforming a complex demographic issue into a simple binary choice between faith and convenience, the bishop provided the emperor with the political resolve necessary to sign the warrant of banishment. His work as the ideological architect ensured that the expulsion was executed as a formal act of state policy, grounded in the systematic application of Counter-Reformation doctrine to the management of the imperial capital. The socio-economic tension within the city of Vienna intensified as the Christian merchant class and artisan guilds organized a systematic opposition to Jewish commercial competition. During the mid-17th century, the traditional guild system operated under a rigid set of local regulations that dictated production quotas, pricing, and membership. These organizations viewed the more flexible business models of the Jewish entrepreneurs as a fundamental threat to their established monopolies. Because Jewish traders were often exempt from specific municipal tariffs and guild fees through their imperial charters, they could offer finished goods and raw materials at more competitive rates. This disparity created a permanent state of friction between the inner-city markets and the island enclave. The guilds utilized their collective political influence to lobby the city council and the provincial parliament for a total ban on Jewish retail activities. They filed numerous formal complaints, alleging that the minority was engaging in the illegal resale of luxury items and the manufacture of textiles without proper certification. These petitions framed the professional success of the Jewish community as an act of economic subversion against the Christian subjects of the crown. By 1668, the municipal authorities had coordinated their efforts with the larger merchant companies to demand a complete segregation of trade. This campaign was not merely localized. It sought to influence the imperial court by arguing that the city's tax base was being eroded by the drainage of capital into non-Christian hands. Furthermore, the guilds collaborated with local magistrates to enforce restrictive ordinances that barred Jewish residents from entering the central marketplaces during peak trading hours. This policy aimed to physically marginalize Jewish commerce and reduce their visibility within the urban core. The organized merchant bodies also funded the dissemination of pamphlets that characterized Jewish business ethics as inherently fraudulent. This coordinated lobbying effort created a hostile atmosphere where the municipal government became a primary advocate for the expulsion. By presenting the removal of the Jewish population as the only viable solution for the economic survival of the Christian middle class, the guilds provided the secular justification that complemented the theological arguments of the imperial court. This external pressure ensured that the drive for banishment was supported by a broad coalition of urban interests. The formalization of anti-Jewish sentiment into a legal mandate was achieved through a series of official petitions presented to the imperial court between 1668 and 1669. These documents were drafted by the Viennese City Council, acting as the collective voice of the municipal government and organized merchant bodies. The petitions asserted that the city's ancient privileges were being systematically undermined by a population operating outside the standard guild hierarchy. These legal requests emphasized the catastrophic impact on the local treasury, arguing that the Jewish community facilitated the export of silver to foreign territories, thereby starving the domestic market of necessary coinage. The legal argumentation within these petitions relied on the concept of temporary residency. The city authorities contended that the protection granted by previous monarchs was a conditional arrangement that had reached its conclusion. They framed the Jewish residents as individuals who had overstayed their allotted tenure and whose activities now posed a direct threat to the welfare of the permanent citizenry. These documents also alleged that households were hosting unregistered occupants, leading to unregulated markets that functioned outside administrative control. By presenting these issues as a matter of municipal security and public order, the council provided the crown with a secular pretext to intervene. The final petitions demanded the absolute and permanent severance of the community from the capital to prevent the perceived ruin of Christian business. The council offered to compensate the imperial treasury for the loss of Jewish tax revenue through a substantial municipal grant, effectively purchasing a monolithic trade environment. This financial offer was the decisive element that neutralized the remaining fiscal concerns of the imperial chancellery. The petitions successfully transformed professional resentment into a documented state of necessity, providing the final administrative impetus required for the formal issuance of the banishment decree. The socio-political climate in Vienna was systematically influenced by the dissemination of religious propaganda that attributed chronic urban challenges to the continued toleration of a non-Christian minority. During the late 1660s, the city experienced a series of natural and civic crises that were interpreted by the ecclesiastical establishment as evidence of spiritual failure. Preachers from the mendicant orders utilized the pulpit to circulate narratives that characterized the Jewish presence as a source of divine judgment. This propaganda shifted the public focus away from the material causes of inflation and disease, offering instead a theological explanation for the city's perceived instability. The circulation of woodcuts and broadsides depicted the island enclave as a center of clandestine activities aimed at the subversion of the established faith. Superstition played a decisive role in mobilizing the illiterate and semi-literate segments of the population against their Jewish neighbors. Recurrent rumors alleged that the minority engaged in the desecration of sacred objects to weaken the spiritual defenses of the monarchy. These accusations were often timed to coincide with major Christian festivals, transforming periods of religious observance into moments of heightened communal tension. The state-sanctioned censorship office permitted the publication of texts that revived ancient slanders regarding ritual practice, providing them with a renewed sense of contemporary urgency. This intellectual environment ensured that any domestic misfortune, from a localized fire to a poor harvest, was immediately linked to the proximity of the unbelievers. Furthermore, the official rhetoric of the court began to incorporate these popular fears into its own administrative logic. The lack of a male heir and the recurring illnesses within the royal apartments were publicly framed as consequences of the emperor's perceived lack of zeal in purifying the capital. This connection between dynastic survival and religious uniformity became a powerful tool for those advocating for the final severance of the Jewish community. The systematic demonization of the minority population created a psychological consensus that transcended class boundaries, uniting the nobility and the urban poor in a shared desire for exclusion. By the time the formal decree was drafted, the public consciousness had been meticulously prepared to accept the removal as a necessary act of national cleansing. In February 1668, a catastrophic fire erupted within the newly constructed Leopoldine wing of the Hofburg Palace, causing extensive structural damage to the imperial residence. While contemporary investigative reports suggested the blaze likely originated from a localized chimney defect or accidental negligence within the construction site, the event was immediately repurposed by political factions as a decisive piece of evidence against the Jewish community. The timing of the conflagration provided the anti-Jewish advocates within the Privy Council with a tangible crisis to justify the acceleration of their exclusionist agenda. Within hours of the incident, officials from the city magistracy began disseminating the claim that the fire was a deliberate act of sabotage, orchestrated by the residents of the island enclave. The legal proceedings that followed the palace fire lacked the rigor of a standard criminal inquiry and were instead dominated by the requirement to find a convenient culprit. Despite the absence of physical evidence linking any member of the minority to the Hofburg, the state utilized the emergency to conduct aggressive searches within the Jewish quarter. These raids were ostensibly performed to uncover hidden stores of incendiary materials, but they functioned primarily as a mechanism of psychological intimidation. The imperial chancellery documented these activities to demonstrate to the populace that the monarch was taking firm action to protect the dynastic seat. This environment of heightened security allowed for the suspension of traditional legal protections, enabling the summary arrest of community leaders for questioning. The fire functioned as the final catalyst for the emperor's personal decision to move beyond legislative restrictions toward a policy of physical removal. The court's spiritual advisors interpreted the destruction of the royal wing as a clear indication that the divine favor of the Habsburgs was compromised by the continued presence of non-Catholic subjects in the capital. This event effectively silenced the remaining pragmatic voices within the treasury who had previously emphasized the importance of Jewish finance. By transforming a domestic accident into a matter of state security and religious necessity, the proponents of expulsion secured the political momentum required to finalize the banishment decree. The ruins of the Hofburg wing remained a visible reminder used to justify the radical administrative measures implemented in the following months. By the close of the 1660s, the internal stability of the Habsburg monarchy was threatened by a looming crisis regarding the biological continuity of the dynasty. Emperor Leopold I faced an acute lack of a surviving male heir, a situation that carried profound implications for the political future of the hereditary lands. Although Empress Margarita Theresa experienced multiple pregnancies during this period, the high rate of infant mortality left the imperial succession in a state of precarious uncertainty. In a governance system predicated on the divine right of kings and the undisputed transmission of power through the male line, this reproductive failure was perceived as a significant vulnerability that could invite external intervention or domestic insurrection. The courtly establishment and the broader public began to analyze this biological misfortune through a strictly theological lens, seeking a spiritual explanation for the dynastic decline. Influential voices within the imperial apartments promoted the narrative that the absence of a successor was a direct manifestation of divine displeasure. Propaganda disseminated by ecclesiastical advisors suggested that God was withholding a male heir as a specific punishment for the emperor's ongoing toleration of the Jewish population. This argument elevated the presence of the minority from a local municipal grievance to an existential threat against the very survival of the Habsburg bloodline. The lack of a male child was presented as a clear sign that the monarchy's spiritual foundation was compromised by the continued proximity of non-Christian subjects. This biological pressure provided the proponents of expulsion with their most effective psychological weapon. They contended that the only path to securing the future of the dynasty lay in a comprehensive act of religious purification. The emperor, whose personal identity was inextricably linked to his role as a Catholic sovereign, was increasingly susceptible to the claim that the removal of the Jews was a mandatory sacrifice for the birth of an heir. This narrative effectively bypassed fiscal and administrative logic, making the banishment a matter of parental and dynastic desperation. By the time the formal expulsion proceedings were initiated, the perceived need for a successor had been successfully fused with the requirement for religious homogeneity, rendering the community's continued residency a spiritual impossibility in the eyes of the imperial household. By late 1669, the decentralized currents of opposition against the Jewish residents of Vienna achieved a total synthesis within the highest deliberative bodies of the Austrian state. This convergence was not the result of a single policy change, but the simultaneous alignment of municipal, ecclesiastical, and dynastic interests. The administrative impasse that had previously characterized the discussions in the Privy Council was resolved as the diverse arguments for exclusion began to reinforce one another. The economic demands of the local merchant guilds were no longer seen as separate from the theological requirements of the Counter-Reformation. This period marked the transition from sporadic legislative restriction to a finalized, comprehensive plan for the total removal of the minority population. The Imperial Commission tasked with the evaluation of Jewish residency reached a definitive consensus during its sessions in the final months of the decade. The Commission members, representing both the clerical and secular branches of the government, concluded that the long-term benefits of a religiously uniform capital outweighed the short-term disruptions to the credit market. This decision was facilitated by the formal commitment from the city treasury to provide a compensatory grant to offset the loss of revenue formerly derived from Jewish tax assessments. This financial guarantee effectively removed the final obstacle for the imperial chancellery, which had remained hesitant to jeopardize the monarchy's access to liquid capital. The administrative machinery of the state was now fully prepared to implement the radical change in legal status. The personal resolve of the emperor was finalized as the cumulative weight of courtly pressure and public agitation rendered the status quo politically untenable. The integration of the palace fire, the succession crisis, and the ongoing petitions created a narrative of national emergency that required an immediate and drastic response. The cabinet ministers observed that the traditional policy of conditional protection had lost its functional value in a state now committed to absolute cultural and spiritual homogeneity. By the close of 1669, the convergence of these diverse pressures had eliminated the possibility of further negotiation. The state's focus shifted from the regulation of the Jewish presence to the logistics of its definitive termination. The formal publication of the imperial edict in the concluding months of 1669 represented the definitive legal termination of Jewish residency in the city of Vienna. This sovereign mandate transformed the theoretical consensus of the imperial commissions into a binding administrative reality. The text of the document was constructed to provide an absolute and irreversible justification for the dismantling of the community, citing the necessity of protecting the spiritual and economic health of the hereditary capital. It explicitly annulled all prior patents of protection and residency certificates granted by the Habsburg predecessors, asserting that the monarch possessed the unilateral authority to rescind these privileges without compensation. The edict functioned as the foundational legal instrument for the systematic dissolution of the social and commercial ties that had integrated the minority into the urban fabric. In its operational clauses, the warrant established a precise schedule for the evacuation of the Jewish quarter, mandating that the process be completed within a fixed interval. The document provided for the creation of a specialized oversight body, tasked with the verification of departures and the enforcement of the strict movement regulations. Legally, the edict reclassified the Jewish subjects as alien elements whose presence was no longer compatible with the public interest. The language of the mandate emphasized that the safety of the state and the preservation of religious order were paramount, overriding any private claims to property or residence. By formalizing the banishment through a written imperial decree, the administration secured a standardized framework that prevented local magistrates from exercising discretionary leniency. The issuance of the decree also authorized the immediate seizure of communal archives and institutional accounts. It provided the legal basis for the suspension of all outstanding civil litigation involving Jewish plaintiffs, effectively freezing their ability to pursue financial claims through the imperial courts. This comprehensive legal severance ensured that the departure would be final and that no future appeals for readmission could be entertained. The 1669 edict thus closed the legal era of conditional residency, replacing it with a definitive policy of state-mandated exclusion. In the early months of 1670, the administrative scope of the banishment was expanded to encompass the entire province of Lower Austria. This legislative extension was prompted by a formal request from the provincial estates, the representative body of the local nobility and clergy. They argued that the removal of the minority from the capital would be ineffective if the displaced population simply relocated to the surrounding manorial estates or smaller market towns. To ensure a comprehensive regional purge, the imperial chancellery drafted a supplementary decree that applied the same conditions of immediate departure to every Jewish settlement within the Crown Land. This move transformed a localized city ordinance into a wide-ranging territorial policy that eliminated all remaining pockets of legal habitation in the Austrian heartlands. The regional implementation of the decree required the mobilization of district captains and local governors who oversaw the dispersed rural communities. These officials were commanded to conduct a full census of all non-Christian inhabitants within their jurisdictions to prevent clandestine residency. Major regional centers, including towns like Krems and Wiener Neustadt, were ordered to terminate all existing commercial licenses held by Jewish residents. The expansion of the mandate also included a provision that forbade rural landowners from providing sanctuary or employment to the exiles under penalty of heavy fines. This systemic blockade ensured that the exodus from the capital was not redirected toward the interior, forcing the population toward the imperial frontiers instead. The provincial administration utilized this mandate to settle long-standing disputes regarding rural trade and agricultural lending by removing Jewish creditors from the provincial economy. The local aristocracy sought to consolidate their control over the peasantry and the regional food supply. This territorial sweep reached the most remote alpine valleys and border districts, ensuring that no administrative loopholes remained. The 1670 extension finalized the transformation of the region into a strictly uniform territory where the legal right to residency was reserved exclusively for those adhering to the official faith. The implementation of the expulsion was managed through a specialized administrative body known as the Execution Commission, which replaced the previous system of courtly protection with a rigid framework of civil oversight. Their primary objective was the exhaustive documentation of the population to ensure that the removal was total and that no unregistered individuals remained within the city walls. Clerks were deployed to the district to conduct house-by-house inspections, producing detailed registers that included age, vocation, and legal status for every inhabitant. Simultaneously, the Commission instituted a rigorous audit of all private and communal financial accounts to regulate the transfer of capital. Imperial accountants surveyed ledger books and commercial contracts, seeking to identify outstanding liabilities that could be claimed by the state or Christian creditors. The administration also established a system of mandatory travel certificates, acting as internal passports. These documents specified the approved route, the number of permitted transport wagons, and the final border crossing point for each family unit. By controlling movement through these certificates, the state prevented uncoordinated migration and ensured exiles reached designated frontiers. The bureaucracy supervised forced asset sales, where commission agents presided over public auctions to verify that transaction prices remained within limits that benefited the municipal treasury and the local Christian guilds. Special officers were appointed to inventory religious libraries and scrolls, surrendering items of significant material value to state archives. This intervention eliminated free market exchange, ensuring the financial dissolution of the community was managed entirely for the benefit of the Crown. These protocols demonstrated the evolution of the state toward centralized population management. This refined administrative machine replaced the flexible policies of the past with a permanent system of state-led displacement. The rigorous enforcement of these operational procedures finalized the transition from transactional residency to a state-mandated existence of total exclusion. This administrative rigor ensured that the expulsion was not a chaotic exodus, but a meticulously tracked movement of subjects across national borders. The time frame for the liquidation of assets was constrained by a rigid 4-month window that transformed the economic landscape of the Jewish quarter into a zone of systemic financial devaluation. Between the official proclamation and the final departure date in mid-1670, thousands were compelled to convert their immovable and specialized properties into portable wealth under conditions of extreme market distortion. This forced transition occurred in a predatory commercial environment where the sudden influx of goods onto the Viennese market led to an immediate collapse in prices. Christian buyers, aware of the absolute legal deadline, withheld fair offers, forcing Jewish sellers to accept small fractions of the appraised value for high-quality merchandise and industrial equipment. The scope of this liquidation encompassed every facet of the community's material existence, from workshops and professional inventory to domestic furnishings and clothing. Specialized manufacturing tools, such as those used in silk processing and precision metalworking, were sold as bulk scrap or seized at minimal rates by local guild members. Extensive stockpiles of raw materials, including imported dyes and fine textiles, were liquidated at prices that failed to cover the initial cost of acquisition. This rapid divestment resulted in the instantaneous destruction of multi-generational capital and the erasure of the community's economic standing. Individuals who had previously managed extensive international trade networks found their assets reduced to the value of basic transport provisions. Furthermore, the process of debt settlement was characterized by significant legal disadvantage for the departing creditors. Many outstanding loans were either summarily canceled or purchased by the municipal treasury at steep discounts, leaving the original lenders with no recourse for full recovery. The requirement to settle all civic obligations before receiving travel clearance ensured that any remaining liquid funds were absorbed by state taxes and municipal fees. This systematic extraction of wealth ensured that the physical exodus began from a position of profound, state-mandated poverty. By the conclusion of the grace period, the previously wealthy financial enclave had been stripped of its capital, leaving behind a vacuum of vacant property and unfulfilled commercial obligations. The administrative requirement for immediate departure fundamentally destabilized the urban real estate market in the Austrian capital, as thousands of residents were simultaneously compelled to divest from their permanent dwellings and commercial premises. The sudden availability of hundreds of residential and industrial titles led to a catastrophic decline in property values. This saturation of the housing market occurred without a corresponding increase in demand, as the eligible pool of purchasers was limited to the Christian citizenry who were already well housed. Consequently, the transaction of real estate transitioned from a competitive exchange into a state of coordinated economic predation. Potential buyers intentionally delayed negotiations until the final weeks preceding the legal deadline, exploiting the sellers' increasing desperation to avoid the total forfeiture of their holdings. Official records from the municipal archives indicate that substantial masonry buildings and established storefronts were transferred for a fraction of their construction costs. In many instances, complex commercial properties, including warehouses and multi-story residences, were traded for the mere price of the land, or a single year's rental income. This extreme devaluation was further exacerbated by a lack of access to impartial appraisal services, as the city magistrates prioritized the rapid transition of ownership over the preservation of equitable market standards. The municipal government actively facilitated these transfers by providing expedited legal processing for Christian citizens acquiring former Jewish property, effectively subsidizing the expansion of the local merchant class. Furthermore, the physical infrastructure of the island district was subjected to a systematic revaluation based on its future utility for the city. Many dwellings were acquired by municipal authorities to be converted into administrative offices or storage facilities. This transition of ownership represented a massive and permanent transfer of wealth from the minority population to the municipal state and its favored subjects. By the time the final departure certificates were issued, the landscape of the enclave had been entirely reconfigured, leaving the departing families with minimal compensation for their ancestral homes and commercial legacy. The terminal phase of the expulsion was marked by an exhaustive fiscal extraction that stripped the departing families of their remaining liquid capital. This process was facilitated by the imposition of heavy departure taxes, calculated as a percentage of the total value of all portable property. The imperial treasury mandated that these levies be paid in hard currency before travel permits were finalized, ensuring that a significant portion of the wealth realized from earlier asset sales was immediately reabsorbed by the state. This administrative requirement prevented the exiles from carrying the necessary funds to establish new commercial enterprises in their eventual destinations. The financial ruin was not merely a byproduct of the move, but a calculated result of the government's exit protocols. Furthermore, the legal framework of the expulsion authorized the summary cancellation of private debts owed by Christian subjects to Jewish creditors. This policy effectively erased a vast network of outstanding loans and interest payments that had been the primary source of income for many households. The loss of these financial assets meant that the community's wealth, which existed largely in the form of credit and contractual obligations, vanished without any possibility of recovery. The imperial courts refused to hear any petitions regarding these uncollected debts, leaving the lenders with zero legal recourse. This unilateral dissolution of contracts represented a total loss of the intangible capital that had taken generations to accumulate. The physical costs of the relocation added another layer of economic devastation. Families were required to pay for their own transport, security details, and temporary housing during the journey to the border. These expenses were compounded by the frequent demands for unofficial payments to local officials and guards at every provincial checkpoint. By the time the exiles reached the frontiers of the empire, the cumulative effect of taxes, lost debts, and travel costs had reduced even the most affluent members of the community to a state of near total insolvency. The transition from established financial agents to impoverished refugees was completed within the span of a single summer. The systematic confiscation of communal assets in 1670 was a foundational component of the state's strategy to ensure that the Jewish community could never re-establish its institutional presence in the region. Beyond private residences, the state targeted all property held in collective ownership, including the administrative offices, educational centers, and charitable institutions that provided the social safety net for the population. This appropriation was managed through a detailed recording process where every item of communal value was registered as the property of the imperial crown. The legal justification for this mass seizure was based on the premise that the community, as a corporate entity, had ceased to exist within the borders of the realm, thereby rendering its holdings subject to immediate state reclamation. The most significant of these assets included the community cemetery located in the district of Rosso. This site, which had served as the primary burial ground for over a century, was confiscated and closed to further use. The state revoked the legal protection of the graves, effectively placing the land under the jurisdiction of the municipal government for future urban development. This act represented a total severance of the community's historical and ancestral connection to the city. Additionally, the specialized buildings used for religious purposes, such as the public ritual baths and the facilities for prepared foods, were repurposed for secular state use or sold to local organizations to be used as warehouses. The transition of these facilities into Christian hands ensured that the physical requirements for maintaining a traditional lifestyle were permanently removed. Furthermore, the recording of the community's movable religious property resulted in the seizure of a vast collection of silver ornaments and high-quality textiles. Items of significant metal value were often sent to the imperial mint to be melted down for the production of state currency, while rare books and documents were incorporated into the royal library. The assets of the Burial Society and other welfare organizations, which held considerable cash reserves for the care of the destitute, were absorbed into the municipal poor fund. This appropriation stripped the community of the financial resources necessary for collective survival in exile. The infrastructure of Jewish life was thus completely eradicated from the Austrian landscape, replaced by state-controlled institutions. The central architectural symbol of Jewish life in the Lower Island District was the Great Synagogue, a structure that had been completed only a few decades prior to the expulsion. This building represented the peak of communal prosperity and was the most prominent non-Christian landmark in the capital's vicinity. In 1670, following the evacuation of the surrounding neighborhood, the imperial administration moved to permanently repurpose the site. The seizure was executed as a formal transfer of the building from the communal elders to the ecclesiastical authorities under the direct supervision of the royal chancellery. This act was designed to ensure that the primary site of religious assembly would be forever lost to its original founders. The physical transformation of the structure involved the systematic removal of all interior elements associated with Jewish liturgy and identity. Stone inscriptions, wooden fixtures, and the decorative elements surrounding the Holy Ark were dismantled and destroyed. The administrative records of the time detail the meticulous effort required to strip the sanctuary of its distinct features to prepare it for its new function as a Catholic parish church. This process of architectural erasure was intended to hide the building's history from future generations of residents. The state ordered the immediate installation of a Christian altar and the placement of statues representing the saints of the Habsburg dynasty within the newly cleared space. The decision to convert the synagogue rather than demolish it served a specific political and theological purpose. By maintaining the physical shell of the building while changing its internal purpose, the state provided a permanent monument to the triumph of the official faith. The conversion signaled that the space had been reclaimed for the spiritual benefit of the monarchy. This transition of the site's function was the final step in the physical displacement of the community's leadership. The building was renamed to honor the reigning emperor's patron saint, effectively overwriting its past. This conversion established a precedent for the treatment of other communal structures throughout the province. The official rededication of the former synagogue as a Catholic parish church in August 1670 served as the definitive ceremonial conclusion to the expulsion process. This event, presided over by Emperor Leopold I and his entire court, was designed as a high-stakes display of Counter-Reformation triumph and dynastic piety. The consecration was not merely a local religious service, but a state-sponsored ritual intended to sanctify the newly vacant district for Christian habitation. By personally attending the dedication, the monarch signaled that the removal of the Jewish population was an achievement central to his imperial legacy. The selection of St. Leopold as the patron of the new church was a calculated choice, linking the current ruler's name to the medieval Margrave, who was considered the traditional protector of Austria. The liturgical proceedings were dominated by a sermon delivered by Bishop von Kolonich, who framed the conversion of the building as a victory over religious error. The rhetoric of the ceremony emphasized the concept of purification, suggesting that the physical space had been cleansed of spiritual contamination. This rededication established a new ecclesiastical boundary for the city, incorporating the former island enclave into the formal parish structure of the capital. The state provided an endowment for a permanent staff of priests to ensure that the site remained an active center of Catholic worship, preventing any future return to its previous function. The internal layout was finalized to emphasize the central role of the sacraments, with the new altar serving as the focal point of the reconfigured hall. Furthermore, the consecration was integrated into the city's official calendar of religious holidays, ensuring that the anniversary of the event would be commemorated annually as a day of national thanksgiving. The transformation of the site from a center of minority life into a monument of state orthodoxy was thus finalized through both legal decree and public ritual. This ceremony effectively transformed the neighborhood into a permanent fixture of the Catholic urban landscape, ensuring that the memory of its former inhabitants was subsumed under the religious and political identity of the Habsburg monarchy. The final phase of the physical evacuation reached its administrative conclusion in the summer of 1670, following the expiration of the ultimate grace period granted by the imperial chancellery. By July, military authorities established a strict perimeter around the residential district to oversee the departure of the remaining families. This operation was characterized by a rigid adherence to the transport manifests compiled by the Execution Commission during the preceding months. The departure was not conducted as a single mass movement, but as a series of coordinated groups organized by their assigned destination and mode of travel. While many utilized heavy wagons for overland transport toward the northern frontiers, others were directed to the river docks for transit toward the eastern territories. The physical handover of the district involved the formal surrender of house keys and commercial permits to the municipal guards stationed at the bridge. Every departing individual was subjected to a final inspection of their travel certificates and portable belongings to ensure compliance with the exit tax regulations. Once a household cleared the checkpoint, their residence was immediately boarded up and marked with the imperial seal to prevent unauthorized re-entry. The state deployed specialized units of infantry to escort the columns of exiles to the provincial borders of Lower Austria, ensuring that no groups attempted to seek sanctuary in the rural hinterlands. These escorts were responsible for maintaining the schedule and preventing contact between the departing population and the local Christian inhabitants. By late August 1670, the administrative records confirmed that the last registered Jewish subject had crossed the sovereign border. The residential enclave, which had housed thousands for decades, was rendered entirely vacant. The military then executed a final sweep of the island, to verify that no individuals remained in hiding within the cellars or warehouse structures. The permanent closure of the gates signaled the absolute termination of the physical presence of the community. This demographic vacuum allowed the municipal authorities to proceed with the planned redistribution of the urban space to the Christian subjects. The official renaming of the island district in late 1670 served as the final administrative mechanism for the permanent erasure of the neighborhood's former identity. Following the total removal of the inhabitants, the imperial chancellery issued a sovereign mandate that the territory formerly known as the Lower Werd would henceforth be designated as Leopoldstadt. This designation was explicitly intended to commemorate the reigning monarch, Leopold I, and to symbolize the reclamation of the land by the Catholic state. This linguistic shift was strictly enforced across all levels of the government, including the drafting of new municipal charters and the updating of provincial land surveys. The previous name, which had been associated with the era of protected residency, was systematically purged from official records to prevent any historical continuity. To solidify this change, the city's Department of Cartography was ordered to produce new maps that reflected the district's integration into the capital's parish system. These documents illustrated the area as a seamless extension of the urban core, effectively removing the visual markers of its previous isolation. The municipal authorities also authorized the physical replacement of all directional signage on the bridges and main thoroughfares connecting the island to the inner city. This rebranding effort was accompanied by the implementation of a new urban development plan that offered financial incentives to Christian subjects who purchased property in the renamed district. To accelerate the demographic transition, the state provided tax holidays and subsidies for the construction of stone facades that adhered to the architectural standards of the imperial residence. The legal status of the area was also reconfigured, with the district being formally incorporated as a city suburb under the direct jurisdiction of the Viennese magistracy. This integration ended the specialized administrative status that the enclave had held for decades. By the conclusion of 1670, the symbolic and legal transformation of the district was total, ensuring that the physical site was permanently aligned with the religious and political identity of the Habsburg monarchy. The renaming functioned as a tool of historical revision, transforming a site of former exclusion into a permanent monument of imperial authority and religious homogeneity. The relocation of the exiled population toward the northern crown lands of Moravia and Bohemia constituted the primary demographic shift following the 1670 decree. Although these territories were under the central authority of the Habsburg monarchy, their provincial administrative structures allowed for a degree of residency that had been abolished in the capital. The movement was directed toward established urban centers, where existing communities could facilitate the absorption of displaced families. In Moravia, the town of Nikolsburg emerged as a critical destination, eventually serving as the seat of the regional rabbinate and a hub for the textile trade. The arrival of hundreds of families led to a significant expansion of the local urban footprint and the intensification of regional credit markets, which had previously lacked sufficient liquid capital. In Bohemia, the city of Prague received the largest contingent of refugees, integrating them into an already substantial and legally recognized municipal district. The Bohemian provincial administration required that all newcomers register with the governor to ensure their presence did not violate established local quotas. Unlike the total ban implemented in the south, these northern provinces maintained a policy of regulated residency, viewing the exiles as a source of tax revenue and industrial expertise. The newcomers introduced advanced techniques in the management of regional trade fairs and the wholesale distribution of raw materials. This sudden demographic increase prompted the local Christian estates to demand stricter limits on the number of new residents and the scope of their commercial activities to protect local monopolies. The imperial government in Vienna maintained persistent oversight of this dispersal to prevent unauthorized movement back toward the provincial heartlands. Periodic inspections were conducted in the Moravian border towns to verify the permanent settlement of the exiles. The transition into these northern territories required a complex social reorganization as the refugees navigated the distinct local laws of the Bohemian and Moravian parliaments. This regional dispersal ensured that while the Jewish presence was eliminated from the imperial center, it remained a vital, regulated component of the broader Habsburg territorial economy. The migration of a significant contingent of exiles toward the northern territory of Brandenburg, Prussia, represented a definitive transition into a non-Habsburg political environment. Following the total banishment from the Austrian heartlands, the Elector Frederick William identified the displaced Viennese community as a valuable demographic asset for his emerging state. In May 1671, the Brandenburg administration issued a formal invitation specifically directed at 50 of the most affluent families from the former Viennese enclave. This decree was a foundational component of a broader mercantilist strategy designed to accelerate the recovery of a region that had suffered extensive depopulation and economic stagnation during the previous decades of European conflict. The state sought to leverage the liquid capital and specialized commercial skills of the refugees to modernize the provincial treasury. The legal conditions offered in Brandenburg differed fundamentally from the precarious protection found in the South. The exiles were granted 20-year residency permits that included the right to purchase land and establish permanent businesses without being subject to the restrictive oversight of local Christian guilds. The government also authorized the creation of communal organizations and the maintenance of private religious facilities, acknowledging that spiritual autonomy was a necessary prerequisite for economic integration. These families were instrumental in establishing the institutional foundations of the Berlin community, introducing advanced accounting methods and international credit networks that had been the hallmark of their previous operations in the Danube region. Their arrival facilitated the growth of the manufacturing sector, particularly in the production of high-value commodities that had been previously imported. The political climate in Brandenburg was defined by the state's pursuit of centralized power and fiscal efficiency rather than the theological rigidity of the Counter-Reformation. While the newcomers were required to pay substantial protection fees, these levies were viewed as professional investments in a stable legal framework. The elector's pragmatic approach demonstrated that the targeted recruitment of skilled minorities could function as a primary engine for national expansion. This resettlement marked the beginning of a new era where the former Viennese subjects were valued as essential contributors to the rising industrial and financial strength of the North German territories. The eastern migration of the Viennese refugees toward the territories of the Ottoman Empire represented the most extensive geographic dispersal of the 1670 expulsion. While many families sought immediate sanctuary in neighboring European principalities, a significant portion opted for the permanent security offered by the Sultan's administration. This movement followed the established commercial arteries of the Danube, transiting through the border regions of Hungary and into the Balkan provinces. The Ottoman state operated under a decentralized legal system that granted internal administrative and religious autonomy to non-Muslim subjects in exchange for a specific annual poll tax. For the exiles, this system provided a degree of legal predictability that had vanished in the Habsburg lands, where protection was subject to the changing personal piety of the monarch. The integration of the Viennese newcomers into the Ottoman urban fabric was facilitated by the existing networks of Jewish communities that had flourished there since the late 15th century. In cities such as Istanbul and Salonika, the refugees found a complex social structure already equipped with the necessary religious and educational institutions. The Ottoman government actively encouraged the settlement of these individuals, recognizing their proficiency in European medicine, textile production, and high-level diplomacy. By the late 17th century, the imperial capital had become a primary destination for those possessing specialized skills in the manufacturing of weaponry and the refinement of precious metals. The state utilized the technical expertise of the German-speaking exiles to modernize its own administrative and military capabilities. Furthermore, the Ottoman Empire functioned as a vital hub for international trade that connected European markets with the East. The Viennese financiers utilized their existing credit networks to facilitate the exchange of goods between the East and the West, operating as essential intermediaries in a global economy. This migration ensured the survival of the community's intellectual and commercial traditions in an environment defined by religious plurality rather than forced homogeneity. The resettlement in the East effectively concluded the physical journey of the 1670 exiles, placing them within a state that prioritized fiscal contribution over theological uniformity. The departure of the Jewish community in 1670 triggered an immediate and profound structural crisis within the financial architecture of the Habsburg Empire. The sudden removal of the primary credit providers resulted in a sharp contraction of liquid capital available to both the imperial court and the municipal government. The system of court agency, which had functioned as the backbone of military and palace logistics, ceased to exist overnight, leading to a paralysis in the procurement of essential goods for the standing army. Christian merchant bodies, despite their successful lobbying for the removal of competition, found themselves unable to replicate the complex international credit instruments that the previous inhabitants had perfected. Interest rates for short-term loans surged as the supply of manageable debt disappeared from the urban market. The imperial treasury struggled to identify domestic alternatives for the specialized services of tax collection and bullion refinement. Without the steady influx of silver formerly provided by Jewish intermediaries, the production of state currency at the mint faced significant delays. The loss of specialized tax farmers meant that the collection of indirect duties on salt and wine became less efficient, resulting in higher administrative costs for the crown. Furthermore, the municipal government of Vienna encountered substantial difficulty in fulfilling its promise to pay a compensatory grant to the emperor. To cover this fiscal shortfall, the city was forced to impose emergency levies on its own Christian citizens, creating unanticipated economic strain among the very groups that had advocated for the expulsion. This fiscal pressure was exacerbated by a decline in customs revenue as the trade routes connecting the Danube to the east were disrupted. The vacuum also extended to the luxury goods sector, where the absence of established wholesalers led to a temporary stagnation in the import of raw materials for high-end manufacturing. By late 1671, the administrative records of the imperial chamber documented a persistent deficit in the royal accounts and a measurable decline in the capital's overall commercial vitality. This structural instability highlighted the extent to which the imperial regime had relied on the group it had legally and physically erased. The completion of the expulsion was viewed by the imperial court as a decisive victory for the principles of the Counter-Reformation. For the ruler and his inner circle, the achievement of a monolithic religious environment superseded the practical warnings issued by the treasury departments. The government adopted a hierarchy of values where spiritual uniformity was the primary metric of sovereign success. This ideology held that a religiously fractured realm was fundamentally weak and susceptible to internal decay. By removing the minority population, the administration sought to demonstrate a total commitment to the restoration of an absolute Catholic society. The state functioned under the belief that material losses in tax revenue were a necessary sacrifice to secure the favor of the divine for the future of the monarchy. Decision-makers prioritized spiritual integrity over the worldly benefits of international credit. This triumph was communicated to international centers of religious power as a landmark accomplishment of the ruling dynasty. It reinforced the status of the monarch as the leading defender of the official faith in Central Europe. The policy of exclusion was part of a broader program targeting the remaining pockets of non-Catholic descent in the Eastern territories. Centralized authority allowed for an efficient consolidation of political power, as the government no longer had to negotiate with diverse groups operating outside the established church. The administrative success of the banishment served as a template for future efforts to enforce cultural conformity across the Crown lands. The court viewed the resulting economic vacuum as a temporary hardship that would be corrected by the blessings of a unified populace. The focus on spiritual purity over fiscal stability represented the peak of clerical influence in policy. Advisors argued that a city defined by a single confession would possess higher social cohesion and internal loyalty. The long-term objective was to transform the capital into a sanctuary of the faith where the absence of dissent witnessed the strength of the regime. This era prioritized a harmonized citizenry above the flexible economic models of the past. The events of 1670 were the ultimate administrative expression of this uncompromising ideological vision, proving that theological objectives governed the highest levels of the imperial state. The 1670 expulsion remains a primary historical example of the consolidated power inherent in the Habsburg version of absolutist governance. This period was characterized by the systematic erosion of medieval corporate rights and the concentration of executive authority within the person of the monarch. The removal of the Jewish population proved that the legal existence of any subject group was entirely dependent on the personal favor of the sovereign, rather than on established constitutional protections. This event signaled a departure from the older model of governance, where the ruler acted as a mediator between different estates and corporations. Instead, the administration of Leopold I functioned on the principle that the monarch's duty was to shape the social and religious composition of the realm to reflect a single, unified vision. The state's ability to unilaterally rescind centuries of documented privileges without legal recourse demonstrated the absolute nature of royal prerogative. This centralization of power allowed the court to override the complex web of local customs and municipal interests that had previously protected diverse populations. The expulsion functioned as a demonstration of state capacity, proving that the central government could mobilize its military and bureaucratic resources to execute a totalizing demographic change. It revealed that economic integration and financial service provided no permanent immunity against the shifting priorities of a centralized autocracy. The vulnerability of the community was a direct consequence of a system that lacked an independent judiciary capable of challenging the decrees of the crown. Furthermore, the events in Vienna established a precedent for the use of state-led displacement as a tool of political and religious management. The monarchy demonstrated that it was willing to sacrifice established commercial networks to achieve a more compliant and homogeneous subject base. This prioritization of ideological consistency over economic pragmatism was a hallmark of the 17th century absolutist state. The expulsion effectively transformed the relationship between the ruler and the ruled, establishing the sovereign as the ultimate arbiter of who belonged within the national community. This era marked the end of pluralistic coexistence in favor of a centralized authority that demanded total cultural and spiritual alignment. By the autumn of 1670, Vienna attained the status of a confessionally unified urban center, marking the conclusion of the most radical demographic reorganization in its early modern history. The official census records maintained by the city magistracy confirmed the total removal of every registered non-Christian household, fulfilling the ideological objectives of the imperial chancellery. This total absence of an organized minority transformed the capital into a social environment where religious conformity was the singular prerequisite for legal residency. The city districts were now populated exclusively by individuals who adhered to the state-sanctioned faith, creating a new urban reality characterized by the absence of visible religious diversity. This state of total exclusion established a definitive legal and social benchmark that governed Austrian domestic policy for several decades. The 1670 banishment served as a permanent administrative reference point for future decisions regarding the management of minority populations within the hereditary lands. It codified the principle that residency was a conditional privilege reserved solely for those who integrated into the official church structure. The previous era of transactional protection was replaced by a rigid policy of non-toleration that prioritized spiritual unity over the practical benefits of a diverse workforce. The communal institutions that had once defined the social fabric of the island enclave were entirely dismantled, leaving no legal space for non-Catholic assembly. The capital functioned as a closed society where the absence of internal dissent was interpreted as a sign of the monarchy's rejuvenated strength. This environment fundamentally influenced the development of the city's civic identity, as the awarding of masterships, trade licenses, and municipal offices became strictly tied to religious affiliation. The Purge transformed Vienna into a model for the centralized management of subjects, proving that the state could successfully execute a totalizing cultural change. While the financial sector remained unstable, the political establishment viewed the resulting institutional silence as the successful restoration of a divinely ordered society. This period of absolute exclusion persisted without interruption until the massive fiscal requirements of subsequent continental wars necessitated a cautious reevaluation of the state's restrictive policies at the turn of the century. If you found this history interesting, this next video will shock you. Click right here to watch it now.